Now, South Africa usually follows an electoral schedule where the national vote is held 2 calendar years before municipal polls. The next municipal elections are due to take place this year, about 15 months rather, after the 2019 national elections. Now, political parties currently having different views on whether the elections should go ahead later on this year as the country grapples with the COVID-19 pandemic. Ibrahim Fakir is the Director of Programs at the OWAL Socio-Economic Research Institute and joins me tonight. Ibrahim, good evening and thank you so much for your time. Now, South Africa doesn't find itself in a unique position when it comes to holding an election or having an election scheduled while in the midst of this pandemic. When we look at what the rest of the world is doing versus what we can do, do you think that there are any specific lessons that we should be reflecting on in this moment?
Kathy, there are countries which have in fact held elections during the pandemic. Of course, the one that everyone was watching most keenly because of Mr. Trump was the US election. So there was one example of one going on during a pandemic. The second, closer to home on the continent, was in Uganda. Of course, South Africa has had a series of local government elections and by-elections, so specifically local government by-elections, and a couple are due to take place very soon. And the thing about those is that their electoral systems ensure that people vote at very specified voting stations. And the same would be true for our local government elections, right? Because you vote in our local government elections at a voting station where you are registered ostensibly and in your ward, in your constituency, so to speak. So it's possible to manage numbers. However, we don't have a credible vaccine rollout. We don't have a plan. And I would hate for this to be an occasion of being a super spreader event. So I think we have to be really cautious about where we are and what we're doing and how we go about doing it. Now, it is possible, I think, to have an election, provided, I think, we streamline the numbers, stagger them, and perhaps have it over 2 days or so. The problem with that is that it will create compound costs because you will be using a greater amount of sanitizing equipment and compliance with health protocols, but you're also using staff for a longer period, you're using facilities for a longer period, and secondly, more importantly, remember, we always have issues and conflagrations about administrative irregularities and issues around the storage of ballots and, fears of ballot stuffing overnight. So it can raise potential problems and can become a flashpoint for conflict. So, it's something to worry about. And I in the exercise of prudence would argue for a postponement for about between 6 and 8 months.
When we look at some of the international research that has come in, Ibrahim, the results seem to vary in terms of whether those who have held elections under COVID-19 have experienced an increase in the number of people voting. You gave the example of the US, and that perhaps is one country where they've increased voters. But some countries are also seeing a decline. As far as you're concerned, when you compare South Africa to other countries in the same income bracket, would it benefit our democracy in terms of the credibility that ultimately every citizen needs to be able to think of and attribute to the election for this election to go ahead?
Well, look, the question of voter turnout is an important one, Kathy, and one's not entirely sure about what the turnout numbers are going to be, because look, the reality is that in our national elections, voter turnout numbers are declining and declining very fast for obvious reasons. Those obvious reasons are not just a disinterest in politics, but a disinterest and a lack of trust in political parties themselves, the central actors in the electoral process, right? Number one. Number two, the major driver of lower turnout at national and provincial elections is declining trust and credibility in institutions of public government. So parliament, the executive, government departments, courts, the judiciary, the police, and so on. Very low levels and declining levels of trust, and therefore declining levels of participation. In our local government elections, curiously, however, even though the turnout is lower comparative to our national and provincial elections, it is generally higher than it is internationally. So close to about 48, 49%, which for a local government is quite high. In the 2016 local government election was even higher. And that was because there was a major turnout in the suburban areas of the country. And that's not a bad thing. It's saying the middle class is still maintaining an interest in politics. So we don't know whether that trend will translate into the present, right? But there are a couple of factors to consider. The first is people's fears around contracting COVID-19, fears around whether there will in fact be credible health protocols and compliance with those, whether there will in fact be real sanitation and so on. So you will have large suburban areas where, depending, and this is how people behave, when it's in their interests, when they want to really just go ahead and do something. And we've seen massive instances of people breaking COVID regulations and breaking state of disaster regulations and limitations and going about doing what they want. People complaining about it. People complaining about the fact that in townships, well, people just behave as they are. In other instances, you'll find that people really do have fears, and health experts would warn about saying, look, this can potentially be a super spreader event. That can dampen people's appetite for simply coming out to vote. Third is that campaigning is going to be very difficult. But, my worry would be less about campaigning. I mean, of course, there's an element of a free election. You want parties to campaign. You want citizens to be able to engage with their message. But they can do door-to-door in fairly safe or safer circumstances. They can talk at a distance. They can talk outside places. But big rallies, that kind of thing, big campaign events, I think those are going to be out. They're not necessarily going to work. So who knows how that's going to drive voter turnout and voter interest. I would be hesitant to go either way. I think there is a fair number of people in society who are genuinely afraid.
Ibrahim, do you think that the by-elections that have been held by the IEC over the last couple of months haven't been a good litmus test to see what would be possible if and should the elections go ahead this year? Because just last week we had the president talking about elections in October,
Kathy, it can obviously prove valuable and instructive as a dry run, as experiential learning. The thing to consider and bear in mind is that a by-election usually attracts a voter turnout of less than 20% of registered voters in that area. Generally, by-election doesn't always attract a massive turnout. To the extent that I'm confounded and there is a greater turnout, sure, it's a great test run. It's a good practical run. But remember, a by-election is for a very small, isolated, specific set of voting stations. Now, yeah, of course it's a great test run, but you don't know whether this is going to be rolled out at the same scale, same quality, if you increase the scale exponentially. And whether all the compliance and the distribution of materials will happen in a way which is safe and which is conducive to a legitimate election. I think it's worth actually invoking this justification of necessity, which is a well-known concept jurisprudentially, to set a set of limits and say, look, let's postpone it for 8 months. Of course, it is irregular. Of course, it goes against the constitutional mandate, but we have a state of disaster. There is sufficient rationalization for why this needs to happen. You put in place a contingency measure to extend the term of office and prolong it, but for a very limited time period. You are stipulating the time period, which is 8 months. And at that point, if government hasn't yet have a credible vaccine rollout plan, then of course you have to go ahead. So I'm not arguing willy-nilly that this must simply be postponed or prolonged endlessly. No, not at all.
Of course, Ibrahim, for those communities whose municipalities are in a state of disarray, they might feel that 8 months is too long and might actually feel that it's better for them to go to the polls sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. I have no doubt that is what most people would think, and that they would actually want the opportunity to either re-legitimize those who are exercising public power and authority, or get the buggers out, as is spoken about generally. But the reality is that I don't know to what degree 8 months is going to make a difference, given the lackadaisical attitude, the laxity, the manner in which local government has approached its functions. Of course, in the last little while, we've seen exponential, service delivery, especially in some areas of Johannesburg. And some governments are going to say, well, we had to recover after the coalition. All of that is bung and all of that's nonsense. It's very clear that this is done because it's the election year. Some people are now copying, say we should have an election every year because it seems like service delivery starts to improve. But Kathy, the short answer is the 8 months I don't think is going to make a major difference towards a turnaround or a major difference in the way in which government performance exponentially suddenly improves in those municipalities which are in dire straits. That's not to say they should continue being in dire straits. What I'm suggesting is that citizens should and ought to start using other means. You've had instances where some municipalities have been taken to court, and the court compelled people to pay rates into a trust account and to let citizen groups take over some of the functions that would traditionally be performed by a municipality in instances where it's really dire. So yes, there's some sympathy for that argument, there's some merit to the argument, but the counterpoint to that argument is, if you think delivery is that bad, would you want to go and have an election in the midst of a pandemic?
Political analyst Ibrahim Fakir. Let's leave it there for tonight. Thanks for your insights.